Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Ad Tech. We're just a few episodes into this season. So far, I've mostly focused on pay-per-click advertising. That is a huge part of digital advertising, but certainly not the only part. We've got video ads, display ads, and even podcasts to cover. We've got privacy concerns and fraud to cover. And along those lines, today I speak with Beatrice Perez, one of the co-authors of I Call BS, Fraud Detection and Crowdfunding Campaigns. Everyone's pretty familiar with crowdfunding at this point. It seems like a nice idea. I've crowdfunded a few things, but it's also a new and, quite frankly, unregulated format for raising money. That's why I was especially glad when I found this paper, which I think is kind of pioneering investigation into these platforms. What types of fraud appear there and how you detect it are just some of the things we'll touch on today.
My full name is Beatrice Perez. My affiliations vary. I started this work when I was a PhD student at UCL. I think that's relevant for Call in particular. We've been trying to get it published for a few years, so the work kind of continued all through my postdoc. And so that would be my second affiliation. I was a postdoc at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And almost recently, I've now transitioned, I guess, into an industry research position. So I'm working with Riverside Research out of Lexington, Massachusetts.
Oh, very exciting. Congratulations. I don't know how much you can talk about there, but are you able to share a few details on the types of work you do now?
The type of work, it's very much like a continuation from what I was doing in my postdoc. So starting with my work at Dartmouth, I started looking into software-defined radios and how to incorporate machine learning and what types of privacy issues come from it. What can we learn about using radio waves for a little bit of the more practical sense for the protection of privacy of users, right? In particular, my work at Dartmouth was IoT in the home. So with Riverside, I'm continuing that work. So it is software-defined radio. And right now I'm looking into secure waveforms and low probability of intercept and low probability of detection transmissions. It's still very interesting work, and it's a research position, so it's very nice.
Well, I think maybe even something we could get into another episode. I think there's a lot to dig into there. But the paper I invited you on to talk about today is I Call BS, Fraud Detection and Crowdfunding Campaigns. I think most listeners have got to have some familiarity with crowdfunding campaigns and these platforms. They are pretty new, but they're also sort of ubiquitous. Or do you find that that's the case?
They are, and I think the concept is not new, and I think it's terrific that we found a digital equivalent to asking for help, right? So crowdfunding, it's very interesting because we live in an interconnected world, right? Like millions of people out there, and some people need help and some people can help, and that group of people switches around all the time. So crowdfunding is a way to tap into that, and it's for different purposes. So sometimes it's a new business proposition, right? So it's an entrepreneurial heart saying, fund my great idea. And other times, like particularly the one that we studied in this project, right, is people just asking for help, specifically medical help. So at least in the US, health insurance is not universal and treatment is very good, but sometimes very expensive. And that is extremely, extremely highlighted when you do transplants. Organ donations, right? And so we were trying to figure out, it's already a charged environment, right? When you write out your story, when you say, gosh, I really need help with my medical circumstances, right? And you say, look, this is what's happening to me. You're already coming from a place where it's not necessarily, where the donor is not going to receive anything back, right? So it really is an appeal to charity, right? And so it's already emotional, you're not receiving anything back. What does fraud mean in this context? And so I guess that was our first hurdle. Is like, how do we define fraud? Because fraud, everyone knows what it is, yet, somehow it kind of slips our mind all the time, right?
I mean, I could make a mistake on my profile. I could say I have disease A, but I actually have variant A prime or something like that. That's not fraud, though. What are the really bad fraudulent cases?
From the very beginning, when we started looking at all of these campaigns, we had to come up sort of with our own classification and kind of have a realistic expectation of what we could classify or not, right? So, for example, a very bad type of fraud would be I create a crowdfunding page for my best friend or for my child or for my, relative, right? And then it's based on a real event, so they really are sick and they really do need help. And people donate to that in good faith, but then I never deliver the money.
Wow. And if verify the people's identities, they exist on social media because they're real.
Exactly. So, for example, that's one of the types of fraud that we would not be able to pick up with the parameters that we've defined in our study. Because what we're focusing on is whether the story that is being told is real, whether there's the appropriate level of detail, whether there's a correspondence between what I'm saying and what I'm asking for. If I decide not to deliver the money at the very end of the road, no amount of machine learning can ever help for that situation.
Not with the data set you'd have from the crowdfunding platform. Maybe if the banks were involved or something, perhaps.
Exactly. If the banks were involved, maybe. But then getting a hold of that data is very difficult.
There must be some mechanisms already in place. How do the platforms protect their users from this sort of fraud today?
So that's a complicated question because you're absolutely right. The platforms do provide a certain level of guarantee, right? So I'm not sure if naming names is useful, but for example, GoFundMe, which is one of the biggest platforms, has a guarantee that they will return the money to the donors if the campaign is found to be fraudulent. So checks do they have? I'm not entirely sure, but I know that when you create a campaign or when you donate a campaign, you can report a campaign as suspicious. And the process is then they would send an email to the organizer of the campaign asking for some additional information. If the additional information, I guess, corresponds, is legitimate or whatever, then the campaign is allowed to continue. And then whoever asked for a reimbursement wouldn't get one. Campaigns they don't go through this process unless somebody reports them as fraud. And for those circumstances, only the people who request the refund will get it. So say that you and I both donate to a campaign that is fraudulent, but only you write the email saying, oh, I would like a refund, then you get your money back, but I don't. So that's the second situation. One of the hurdles that we had in collecting this data set was that when this happens, right, when a campaign is reported as fraud, it is, I think, first disabled for a little while, so that the people that have donated can go in and see what's going on. And after some period of time that we haven't been able to determine how long that is, then the campaign disappears. It is as if it was never there. And so there's no evidence. So part of our data set was recovered from the Internet Archive, I think, and they had screenshots of some of the fraudulent campaigns that have since been removed altogether.
What sort of data set, or maybe in terms of size or volume, can you describe what you're able to collect?
We were 4 co-authors in this paper, and life has taken us to 4 different countries. So it's a very international group, which is very fun. We were aiming to get all of the campaigns that were relevant to organ transplants. That was our mission, our goal. And so we kind of did a study of the major crowdfunding platforms, then the ones that had the most campaigns. We created scrapers in Python for each of them. And we queried for every type of organ. So we had an organ-based search and a location-based search around the major cities in the US because we couldn't really do it on a global scale. So the type of data that we collected was pretty much anything we could see. That's what we were going for. We collected the name of the organizer, the name of the beneficiary, the date at which the campaign was posted, whether it was active or not, what donations had been made, like the amounts of the donations and the name of the donor, the description of the campaign, any multimedia attached to it, so sometimes pictures or videos. We collected updates and comments from each campaign. I think altogether, without cleaning the data set, I'm sure we had somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 50 or 60,000 campaigns. But then the cleaning process started and that number got reduced to maybe 20,000 clean campaigns. And for this study in particular, we used somewhere around 700.
What made a campaign dirty or something you want to filter out?
We didn't read all of them, but if it didn't have a full set of information, so if it didn't have a description, for example, we wouldn't be able to use it because part of our analysis is NLP. If we don't have text, then we can't use it. Another reason why it may have been discarded was it wasn't relevant to our search. So for example, if one of the results would say, oh, I need help with my lawyer fees that come from a car crash where I was injured, that would maybe potentially be labeled as a medical campaign because you had a car crash and you were injured, but the money is going towards your lawyer fees. We wanted to focus on campaigns that had medical reasons behind it, but more than reasons, that the money was going towards a medical expense.
Makes sense, because then you'll see consistent patterns, and I assume the dollar amounts are significant in almost all the cases. Are there any other incentives to focus on that category in particular?
I think that they're long-standing. So typically when you're having any type of transplant, it is urgent, but it's not immediate. So you may be on the transplant list for a while. And by the time that you get your operation and then the recuperation time. So it gave us a nice time span. if I quickly go to you, oh, I need $5, I don't know, get a blood test or something like that. There's very little way that you can follow up with me to make sure that is whether what I'm asking for is legitimate or not, right? But if over the course of maybe 5 years or maybe 3 years, or it gives for, more stable type of circumstances, I guess.
So you got a nice data set. You talked about some of the raw data you got from scraping, but it's very raw. It's not like people say, I am a fraudster as the username. What needs to take place next?
So the labeling was very complicated because, and this I learned as I was working on this project, and apparently a group of social science researchers determined that even within people of the same culture, we're only about 50% good at saying when we're being lied to. And I found that hilarious. Come on, we can do better, And it's very, very hard to determine when somebody's lying to us online. So what we ended up doing was looking for 5 people who would annotate each of the campaigns that we ended up using. And we tried to come up with some criteria. And we tried to keep it as much as possible so that when we said fraud, we were absolutely certain that that campaign was fraudulent. And to be absolutely certain, that is saying a lot, right? Because it's not, I smell a fish. That's not the bar. What we're saying is this person or X person was convicted for, stealing, or was convicted for fraud.
So you have some ground truth here, at least as far as the court system goes.
Yeah, exactly. So for some campaigns, we did have ground truth as far as courts. For some others, it was, please send some money to help with the funeral expenses of my dear XXX, right? And then that person would go in the comments and say, I'm still alive. Don't donate to this. So you see, that one is also, we're absolutely certain is fraud. So there were different ways where we could do this. Either, a clear and unequivocal, reprimand, or a conviction. And when you make it that tight, the numbers dropped very quickly for the fraud cases.
What sort of ballpark numbers do you get down to? What percentage qualify at that standard of evidence? Thanks to our annual sponsor, Weights and Biases, the developer-first ML platform. Weights and Biases is an enterprise-grade platform that gives you experiment tracking, dataset versioning, and model management. Their solution integrates with TensorFlow, sklearn, XGBoost, Hugging Face, and literally every other framework I could think of. Integrating with your model training process takes just a few lines of code, and there's even a nice live notebook on their site that'll show you how to get it going. Once your machine learning code base or notebook is wired up, you've just unlocked the next level of productivity. The Weights and Biases platform collects, aggregates, and beautifully displays all of your key metrics and telemetry so you can track your model training in real time and compare different runs. Have you ever had to screenshot a matplotlib graph that you drop in an email or in Slack to show your boss the results of your work? That's like serving a gourmet dinner in a cardboard box. With Weights and Biases, all of your collaborators can see the results of different runs with an idealized interactive suite of tools. You no longer have to be the single source of truth for your whole organization about how the model's doing. If you're on or leading a growing team of machine learning practitioners, you need to investigate if Weights and Biases is the right solution for you. Get started at wandb.me/dataskeptic and mention us when you request a demo. Thanks to our sponsor BB Edit from Bare Bones Software. If you're a Mac user and you have any need whatsoever for a text editor, which, let's face it, that's got to be all of us, you have got to check out BB Edit. BB Edit 14 provides Mac users the most powerful, professional-grade text editor around. It's known as capable and rock solid, and can process files that are large enough to bring other editors to their knees. This tool's been beloved for over 25 years, and I can understand why. If I'm just typing up some simple hello world, I guess any text editor will do. But when I really get into the weeds and need to do some data processing, maybe I've got a big messy file, I need to find all the non-ASCII characters and remove them, BB Edit's there for me. It has best-of-breed multi-file search and replace and great scripting support for text transformations. There's a whole menu of text transformations that you'll find handy. If you're a serious data scientist or software engineer, you're going to bump into situations where you need a powerful text editor. So download and try BB Edit today. You can get it at www.barebones.com. See how much your productivity can increase. barebones.com and download BB Edit. What sort of ballpark numbers do you get down to? What percentage qualify at that standard of evidence?
So we stopped when we had, I think, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but I think it was around 300. And that's how we came to the 700 campaigns, right? When we had in the vicinity of 300 fraud labels, we stopped. Obviously, we had a lot more not fraud, but we couldn't use them because our limiting case, our limiting class was the fraud.
So you have then human annotators going through and looking at them. What happens when you compare the results of amongst the annotators?
That was very interesting. So we used an online platform to recruit our annotators. So it was 2 authors and 3 annotators going through the labels. And as it happened, it wasn't by design, by coincidence. All 5 of us were from different nationalities, different ethnic groups, different everything. So that's just information out there. And for the most part, at the end, when we finished annotating all of it, all 5 of us, there were only like 14 cases where it wasn't very clear, where we were tied. It's not perfect, but I'm reasonably certain of the claims that we make in that paper. And again, this is the maximum number of campaigns that are out there that are fraudulent. This is based on some very strict parameters. This is the minimum that we can find.
At the strictest level of evidence, you have the floor, basically.
Exactly. We have the floor. That's what we were trying to determine.
I'll put you on the spot then. Could you approximate where you think the ceiling might be? What percentage of campaigns at the worst could be fraud?
So I think the claim, let me look at the number, but I think the claim from the crowdfunding platforms is that 0.1% of campaigns are fraudulent. What we found was closer, I think, to 1%.
Just an order of magnitude off.
Just an order of magnitude off, barely any difference. And I don't know how much more we can go from that because I don't know, maybe 5% possibly. But I also don't want to scare people off. This is not every other campaign that is fraudulent. And the goal of the paper was to give people the confidence of saying, oh, I'm reasonably certain that I'm not being lied to. So that when you go donate, you can participate in this community with a little bit of reassurance that the money that you're donating is going to what you think is going to.
Well, I'm curious then, you had the human annotators look at it and they can use all of their human brain's faculties and maybe even the internet. It's a pretty nice system for looking at this stuff, but it doesn't scale. What if we want to apply machine learning to this problem?
Okay, so one of the things you asked before, and I forgot to mention this, is that one of the reasons why we would discard a campaign was if it was alive for less than 6 months. So we said within 6 months is too soon for humans to be able to do very much with that information, right? So what we did was the human annotators had access to the full campaign, everything about it. I remember, for example, one campaign where every single donation was, I think, $25 and was coming from the same person. Whatever, I'm putting that out there, but that's very fishy to me.
Yeah, sounds like some sort of financial scam.
Something like that was going on. I don't know what, but it was fishy. And as a human annotator, I can read this and I know that that's a red flag in my head, regardless of what the description says. So in that sense, we had a lot more information that we were going to end up eventually providing to the classifier. So as human annotators, we looked at the comments. Like I mentioned before, I'm still alive. Please don't donate here. We looked at the amount and the donors themselves because we saw a few where it was a fixed amount and very, very few donors. We looked at the pictures. So sometimes the pictures didn't quite correspond. Sometimes, for some of these, I can't tell you exactly what it was, but it was like, oof, gosh, that's complicated. You're asking me for money for, I don't know, because you're sick, yet you're putting a picture of your house. I don't see how this connects. In addition to the update and the description, right? So once we finished all of the annotations with a completely different hat, in a completely different mindset, or at least that's what we tried, was to try to extract as many clues as we could from the text and from the pictures. So it was almost like 2 completely separate parts of the study. So from the text, we ended up extracting the sentiment. We did sentiment analysis on it. We did complexity and language choice. So the level of detail maybe provided with each description. We did named entity recognition. So it's like numbers and proper nouns and all these things. We looked at the shape of the word. So whether it was all written in capital letters, whether it had an apostrophe, whether it had an emoji at the end of it. And then we did word importance. The last one, the word importance, was very helpful, but I think it was very useful because we were on topic. All of the campaigns were on the same idea.
All right, so we've got some cool text features. What are you able to do with the images?
So for the images, we were able to somewhat mimic, or we were trying to make it comparable to their text data or to our text features. So we did emotion analysis on the images themselves. Then we tried to get descriptors from the images. So the appearance, whether there was a color hue that was specific to whether the colors displayed in the picture would reflect whether it was fraudulent or not, and the number of faces in the pictures. But again, we were very much exploring. It wasn't a guided, oh, we're sure this is going to be it. It was kind of like, is it going to work or not?
Well, I would imagine there's no obvious feature here. It wasn't that you could say, every time they misspell cancer, we know it's fraudulent. It really has to be an ensemble of all of these factors.
Exactly. As you can imagine, we had, I think, over 5,000 features combined, like across both text and images. And so it's a pretty sparse matrix. So what we did to reduce the number of features that we were looking at was we did the KS test, I think Commerce Neural Enough test, and we removed the features for which the distribution was similar or present in some other feature. And so at the end, I think we used something like maybe 500 features altogether. So we reduced it quite a bit. We got fairly good results from our metrics.
So you've got a lot of features for the number of rows as well, but let's get into the details. What kind of performance do you see coming out of the model?
Each annotator would label the campaign in one of 5 numbers. We had a 5-point scale. So we went from definitely fraud, probably fraud, unknown, probably not fraud, and definitely not fraud, right? Because we had the 5 levels, we tried different groupings of these levels to see how well they would correspond. So we tried whether, definitely and probably at both ends, and then we tried exclusively definitely at both ends, right? And so we got different numbers with each one, but overall we ended up reporting in this paper what we call the second label, so the extremes, the definitely ones. So we would train and test on definitely. That was the first one. And for that one, our numbers were, we got over 90% in all of them. So we got a precision of 91, a recall of 90, and an area under the curve, an AUC of 96, using the neural network classifier, so which was pretty cool. And then I think one of the highlights is that obviously, when we use the extremes, our numbers are reduced. But what we did then was to train on the extremes and then test on the in-between ones, right? On the softer label. And when you train on the extremes and test on all of them, I think the number was like 94%.
So meaning if I have the extreme model, I can predict the somewhat fraudulent or most likely not fraudulent, even though I hadn't seen those 2 labels before, but I would put them in the closest mode?
Yeah.
Let's dig into some of the features. What was the model doing under the hood?
The features were a challenge. They were very interesting, but under the hood, and I think if your readers, if you would like to follow, we were trying to come up with the difference between the 2 of them. So we looked at each group of features separately. So I think one of the coolest things that we were able to find was, for example, on the text, right? The campaigns that were fraudulent had more of a time crunch, a time pressure to them. If you have it handy, figure 2 on the paper would be like it would be money, help, please, cancer, get. Those are the stronger ones for the fraud campaigns, whereas the non-fraud had the organs themselves, so kidney, transplant, heart, medical, work, time. There definitely was a different feel to them. We found that the non-fraudulent campaigns were much more positive. They were painting as a picture, a full picture of what they were trying to present. And that was very nice. We found that, and I think this was what we expected, but pretty obvious, in terms of the images were interesting because they were less indicative of fraud versus not fraud than what we originally thought. Okay, we originally thought that they would be key in determining whether someone was being a copycat of somebody else. But what we ended up finding was that the campaigns that were legitimate, the campaigns that were not fraud, so the crowdfunding campaigns will say, when you create a campaign, find a positive picture, find a nice picture, find a picture where the reason for the campaign is front and center type of thing. So in that sense, all of the pictures were very similar. What we found was that for the campaigns that were for the campaigns that were not fraud, they also included pictures of the beneficiary of the campaign in the hospital, or it's part of their life, right? These people would be sick. right? So they would also celebrate from the hospital, and they would, be in a group from the hospital. So the elements, the objects that were in the pictures were different themselves. So that was very interesting too.
Could you remind me what your image features are? Is it sort of images, you know what's in the photo, like the items, like there's a tray and a plant and a desk? Is it that sort of level of detail?
Yeah, that sort of level of detail. Sometimes, so it's very interesting because we didn't run, like, the image descriptors were not very good. However, they were all equally as bad, if that makes any sense. So when
Mm-hmm.
you look at the paper, one of the objects, like I'm looking at it right now on figure 3, and it says barbershop was one of the most common objects for fraudulent campaigns. Now, I am not saying, and I don't think this is our purpose, to say that, oh, barbershops, if you have a picture of a barbershop, you're clearly committing fraud. That's not it at
Right,
all,
right.
right? Well, I think that what this indicates is that whatever it is that it was in the picture that was identified as a barbershop, and we're focusing on medical campaigns, I don't think there's a lot of barbershops in there, right? But clearly the classifier was confused by something that it thought was a barbershop. You see? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little hesitant with the labels of the objects, but I'm reasonably sure that they were all equally mislabeled.
Well, having the ground truth labels gives you enough confidence to compare the model in that regard. But you're also dealing with a model that's built on, a lot of features, not a huge data set just yet. Do you have a vision for what's the limiting reactant? Like, should you maybe increase the data set size or look into more features? Where can the improvement come from in the future?
Oof. This is a topic that I think it's near and dear to all of us because the internet is a terrific tool, but the truthfulness of the things that are said there, right? And this is not a let's limit people's freedom of speech type of comment, but this is there's actual truth in the world. There are things that are actually happening, right? So we need to figure out a way to separate someone's opinion from someone's observations, right?
Yeah.
And so the model that we were able to build was specific for medical crowdfunding campaigns based on emotional appeals. You see, it's very restrictive. Space to grow, there's plenty. And I think one of the biggest places that we can grow is to grow towards, a general deception model. I'm sure that, subconsciously we speak differently when we're talking about things that we see versus when we're talking about things that we believe. And maybe
Mm-hmm.
doing more research towards that, towards, what is fact? What is it that is actually happening? We'll figure out everything else later. You can say what your opinion is. That's absolutely fine. But I want to know what's actually happening. You know, I think if we manage that, that can help with disinformation in general. That can help with fake news. That can help with, I don't know, emergency situations, right? Well, at the time that we were doing this study, I don't remember correctly, but I believe there was an emergency event in Miami, I think. We also found that many of the some crowdfunding campaigns would pop up to collect funds for victims of these events, right?
It's horrible.
It's horrible, but gosh, what is actually happening versus what do you want me to believe? You know, that would be a
Sure.
great
Yeah.
contribution that science can get into.
Absolutely. Yeah. And making sure we're optimizing the best use of our charitable dollars to the best causes.
Exactly, because there's 7 billion of us, and everybody needs help, right? Like I,
For
I,
sure.
I believe this, but we can't really help all 7 billion.
Have you heard anything from the platforms themselves in this research? I think there's things they could learn from the paper. What are they doing about it?
We tried reaching out, but and nobody got back to us. One of the things that we were hoping for was to create a metric, like a traffic light type of system, where we could give potential donors a score of, you know, again, make your own decision, but based on the information that is here available now, we believe that there is a percentage, right, a likelihood of that campaign being fraudulent or not. I think this would be a great addition to any one of the crowdfunding platforms, but Nobody has reached out to us.
What degree of research do you think needs to go on before that can really be on the production sites? I mean, maybe it's something that we could take the model and use as is, but I imagine there's a certain amount of research and testing to be done. If everything came through green light, let's do this. What do you think the hurdles would be to get a better indicator out to people?
Well, I think as everything in privacy and security, it's kind of an adversarial task where
Yeah,
as soon as you make it a little bit harder, the bad guys will also get a little bit smarter.
sure,
So
absolutely.
we need to figure out a way where the work that we do is not immediately defeated. There's a lot of we can learn from the gaming side of the world, where they had to deal with cheaters in their games for decades now, right? And it's a very similar type of problem. So that's one. We need to figure out that the work is not in vain, like useless. We also need to figure out a way to protect the privacy of the donors as they install and use this thing, because it would be useful if the model could be adaptive to each one of the campaigns they visit, or to the, I don't know, maybe the knowledge they have of one particular campaign, right? Like, there is zero information there, but I'm donating to my, I don't know, to my neighbor who I
Yeah, who I
met,
know.
see,
Yeah,
know, live next to. So even if the traffic light gives me, oh, this may be fraud, right? Maybe I could provide feedback and be like, no, I'm sure it's not, you know? And maybe
sure.
that could feed back into the system. So it could be adaptive. But again, it's complicated.
Definitely. Yeah, and there will be people trying to be fake identities there as well. It's a whole
Exactly.
cat and mouse game.
Yeah, but definitely more space for research for sure.
Absolutely. Do you hope to be actively, or are you still actively engaged in that area? Or are you looking at different types of online interactions now?
Uh, I hope to continue being. I'm not right now. Well, and that's not entirely true. I am right now in trying to publish this paper, right? But I'm not engaged in any other research on this topic. That's not to say that I don't want to be. I would definitely want to continue, but I guess it depends on where I'm working on the interest of people at the time, on the collaborators that I can find to work with me.
Well, to wrap up, maybe I would like to know a little bit about your personal take on these platforms. Were you someone who did funding things before this research, and has the research swayed you one way or the other about participating?
I think this research has opened my eyes to the ways that we can do things better, definitely. And I haven't participated directly in crowdfunding, but, you know, I've been more aware of it and tried to donate in different ways. Uh, I think it's a terrific idea, honestly.
And for people who are on those sites, I'm not super active, but I've done things on all of them. Are there any tips you have for what to look out for?
Yeah, this website that we use kind of as ground truth is called Go Fraud Me. And the curator of that website, she's an investigative journalist. And she has some ideas and some others that are based on research. One of the things that I have learned is that there is no substitute for knowing a person. When
Mm-hmm.
your online network is a reflection of your physical network, of your in person network, you're very safe. Apart from that, if you don't know anyone and you really want to help, there are things to look out for. So some are very simple. If you use your name and it's you, you're less likely to be doing something that is fraudulent because you only have one name, you know, and you only have like I don't know. It's like a credit report, I guess, or an equivalent on your truthfulness.
Mm-hmm.
So the number of shares in social media, right? The connections between you and the person who's receiving it is also telling. And then some other cases are very difficult because people are creative, right? And I know, for example, I remember one of the crowdfunding cases, and I think this was one where I had the most trouble with one of my co-authors in trying to label it. We were reading, or I was reading at the time, Hunger Games, and I
Uh-huh.
think that the organizer of this crowdfunding campaign was reading the same game because she was raising fundraising for herself, and she referred to herself as the girl on fire, and I think that's a reference to Hunger Games, and she was describing her medical condition as feeling pain all the time, and so, but it was very metaphorical, the whole thing. Metaphorical does not mean fake. However, it didn't give me what I was expecting, you know? So sometimes just go with your gut feelings. Like, people are fun. This is not an exact science. And also, if you're willing to share, if you're willing to contribute, the positive that can come out of, I guess, if what I'm trying to say in nice words is that if you're going to get duped, it's nicer, or it's better for me to err in the size of on the side of I'm trying to help. If the other person is trying to bamboozle me, then I can't do very much about that. I used my best judgment and I still got it wrong. Oh well, you know?
Well, I have a friend who's involved in philanthropy and shared something I thought was insightful on this exact idea. Like, how do you know you don't do a bad one every once in a while? And he says, well, if you do enough, it'll be a small percentage and it just nets out.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
As long as the platforms have a small percentage of fraud on them, which I guess is why research like this should certainly continue.
Yeah, thank you.
Beatrice, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Data Skeptic.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was very, very fun.